Hello. Today, for this video, we are going to be talking about how I make my Puppets comics look vintage. I get a lot of people asking about how I make them look so retro looking, like they're a real comic from like the 50s and 60s. So in this video, I'll explain to you exactly how I go about doing that whole thing, and also kind of just talking about the behind the scenes of it in general. If you don't know, and if you're new to my channel, the Puppets are my original characters, and they are a comic that I have on Webtoon. It is a group of 11 dog girls, and it takes place in like a vague mid-century-esque era, and they are aspiring showgirls, and their big dream is to get onto Broad Street and become one of the best showgirl groups in the country. I have a bunch of comics up about them already, and I will share them here. For those of you who have been following along for so long, you know that I started the Puppets in 2019, and I did start with a little comic on Webtoon. Initially, the setup was different, the storyline was slightly different, and just the whole look and feel of it was completely different. I put it on pause because I wanted to make it into a little video game instead. I kind of wanted to make like a rhythm game slash visual novel. Unfortunately, COVID hit and a lot of things happened and a lot of things changed. I have a bunch of other videos where I kind of go into the detail on everything, and you can look in my Puppets playlist to see all of the updates and everything, all of the behind the scenes and news on all of that. But the game ended up being shelved, put on the back burner, and I decided to pick the comic back up. But this time I decided to go for a different approach. I really wanted to emulate comics from the 1950s and the 1960s, and I really wanted these comics to be like easy to digest, easy to read, sweet, fun, lighthearted, just stuff that is very feel good, you know, like you read it and you walk away just feeling like, oh, that was really nice. And I also really wanted it to look like vintage comics. So one of the first things I did before I started this whole project was I went and I researched a bunch of vintage comics. I looked up different kinds, and I kind of decided that I wanted to follow vaguely the guidelines of comics that were aimed more towards girls in the 50s and 60s and during the Silver Age of comics. I wanted their layouts on the page to be simple. I wanted them to be mostly squares because a lot of modern comics today are very intricate, and I wanted it to be very kind of basic and easy to read and easy to digest. So I tried to follow the layout of a lot of these vintage comics. I did end up going to a few comic book shops near me and finding some vintage comics from the 50s and 60s. And what I did first before anything was I really just poured into these and looked at how all of the pages were laid out, how they approached text bubbles, how they approached dialogue, how they approached coloring and line art, and I applied that to my stuff. One thing that I definitely noticed, like I said, was that the panels are very square and not as complicated. Backgrounds are very minimal, colored minimally. Line art is black, and there's not really any color to the line art that much. And dialogue is fun and breezy and kind of cringy sometimes, or like corny, and I kind of liked that corny vibe. And also I had to think about how these were printed in the past. Comic books in the 50s and 60s were usually printed on a lithography web press, and they had like 4 spot colors, and then you see all the little dots and everything. That's how they combined colors, by putting dots on dots to get different colors. And so I wanted to kind of emulate that. I didn't want to do it exactly that way because I did want to save myself some time and effort. So I did a lot of cheats and workarounds on this instead of doing it exactly how, or like a digital version of how they did it. There are ways to do this digitally, which I could technically go into in another video, but I really wanted to make comics that were A, easy for the reader to digest, B, easy for me to create because I am doing so many things that I needed something that I could kind of sit down and take like maybe a few days to pump out. And just something that wasn't like super labor intensive, but still fun and still visually appealing. And I think, I'm really kind of getting it down now. So with all of that said and done, we can kind of jump into how I started doing this page. This is Dottie's character introduction. For all of these puppets, for the first round, I wanted to just do character introductions of all of the girls because my plan is to release a physical volume of this with just all of the girls' character introductions, as well as some fun little quick comics in the middle and maybe some little outfit photos and stuff in the middle as well. But I do really want to release a physical copy of this. So this was my first goal, was to create all of the character introductions and some little side things that I could easily like squish together into their first volume. So this is Dottie's. Now, the first thing I did was literally just plan out where everything was going. At this point, I have hired a writer to help me with this, which is probably one of the best things I could have done. My friend Carrie Tupper is the creator of her own comic, her and her husband. It is called Kamikaze. I'll provide a link for that down below. But Carrie is a very experienced writer for comics, and so she often helps me with not only the writing but the layout as well. So I thumbed out all of the panels and everything. This one was a little more complicated because this was the biggest amount of panels that we had on a page. I wanted all of them to be able to fit on a single page, 9x6, so that they were easy to put into a 9x6 booklet. Each girl would get one little cover illustration, which you saw me working on a little bit earlier, and then their little page of introductions. So obviously my first step was to lay out everything. Then I went back in and placed all of the text and figured out where I was putting all of the text bubbles, and then also started my second round of sketches on the actual characters. Once I was pretty happy with that, and Carrie and I bounced back and forth a little bit between layout and design and everything, I went back in with my line art and finalized where all of the boxes and the speech bubbles would go. I'm kind of speeding through this part because there isn't anything specifically unique, I think, besides the fact that my layout specifically, I'm trying to emulate the layout of vintage comics, which is like more square boxes, and the text bubbles are usually around the same shape. I also noted that a lot of the times they sat up towards the top of the panel, so I tried to do that as well. But other than that, is just like sketches and line art with the same sort of line art brush that I use with everything, and that line art brush is linked in the box below. All right, we're gonna get into the coloring part in a minute. And I wanted to just mention that all of the brushes that I use will be linked in the box below. But I think that one of the ways that makes this look very vintage is dependent on the types of brushes you use. So I use a blend of these gouache brushes that I bought, as well as some screen tone brushes, and a lot of it is just blending it all together. This is very much a trust the process situation where it looks kind of weird and messy in the beginning and you're kind of like, ooh, I don't know how this is going to turn out. But once everything comes together, then it looks nice. But you're going to see in the beginning, it's going to look very messy and weird. So once my line art is done, I'm going to do backgrounds first. I'm using this textured round brush that is in the gouache pack. And when I am doing the backgrounds, I keep it very loose and I keep it kind of messy. To be honest, I think it's okay that it's messy because I think that a lot of the times these vintage comics had like a slightly messier quality to them because of either the way they were printed or just like how the artist painted them. Like the backgrounds were really loose and sometimes the printing was off register a little bit. You see a lot of colors bleeding through and sitting on top of each other and stuff. So it looks messy and there's like white gaps and everything, but I think it lends itself to that kind of vintage comic quality. The next thing I do is go into the screen tones and use this beat tone brush. And on a new layer, I basically am picking some brighter colors and sitting this layer on top and then just brushing screen tone pattern over everything in just kind of like whatever color I feel works the best. And I eventually set this layer to multiply. I also want to note that it is really important to work in a limited color palette if you want it to look kind of retro, because if you take into consideration the way that things were printed in the past, they had a limited palette themselves. So I always set up a palette in Procreate and I really only select colors from that palette and I really don't deviate. Any color variation that I desperately need, I'll either cheat by using a different color screen tone on top. So for example, the purple on Dottie is really supposed to be way more purple than it is in this comic. She looks more red. So I went in with my screen tone brush and added a blue layer on top and set it to, I think it was like highlight or something, in order to make it a little more purple. Sometimes, and only in very rare cases, will I do a very custom color that's not in my chosen color palette, but for the most part I really try to stay true to the color palette that I have picked. And I think that also really helps with that retro feel. Now to add little things like lip shine and eye color and stuff. One thing I noted also in vintage comics is their lips are done in the line art, so they're black, and then they just have a little tiny dot of color. And so I used that same technique on these comics. It doesn't mean that they wear black lipstick, it just means that whatever their highlight color is actually technically probably closer to the color. Okay, so now that we have basically all of our art done, like I said, hopefully earlier in this video, because I'm gonna do a voiceover, it's okay if it's messy, and in fact, it's usually a little better if it's messy. But we have basically all of our colors down, and we have all of our screen tone layers and everything. I have a lot of layers set to multiply. This one also should be set to multiply. I have some set to some other layers, but the multiply kind of helps it look a little older. We're gonna jump into all of the other things now. This is where like all of the effects kind of come together. So one of the first things that we're gonna do is we're going to duplicate our line art layer. This is, I never label any of my layers because I'm messy like that. Okay, I labeled these for ease for this video, but I normally never label anything. So I'm gonna duplicate this layer. So I have two. Now the top layer, we're going to go into color balance, and I'm gonna zoom in so that you can see kind of like a good example here. We're bumping it all to red, and we want it to be like very saturated. So you might have to do this a few times. So bright red. Then we go and change this layer setting to color burn, and then we're gonna scoot it just a smidge like that. That kind of makes it look, I forget what it's called, like when it's slightly off printed. Then we are going to go to chromatic aberration, displace, and then we're gonna just like ever so slightly skew it even more, and then blur, maybe around 17, but it's whatever your heart tells you. And then we're gonna drop the opacity like 46-ish. I like to keep it under 50. And then to our regular line art, we are going to go to chromatic aberration, displace, slightly skew it again, just ever so slightly, like that. Just like the smidge. And then we're gonna go to blur again to maybe like 4. Just so it's like really slightly blurry. And then we're going to do the same thing on our border. Duplicate it. We want to do the same with our text, but might run out of layers because we have so many. So normally I'll like duplicate this, but yeah, I have reached my limit. That was my one pet peeve with Procreate. So I'm going to flatten all of these. So for the text, because it's kind of small, I'm just gonna do the chromatic aberration instead. We're just gonna make it slightly, you don't want it too blurry. So now we're gonna go, now this group is full of different layers. I already have these layers set because I'm already using these from other things, so I already know what I'm doing. But basically we have a bunch of paper texture layers. So I have, this is like from a bundle pack of paper textures that I will provide in the link below. They have it set to a very specific way where one of them is set to multiply, one of them is set to color burn, and then one of them is set to screen. So that's one section, these ones here. Then I also have another layer, paper texture color kind of, that I think I made with one of these brushes I have. I think it's like one of these comic creator halftone brushes
that is set to soft light, and then I have a layer of like distressed stuff, so that makes it also look old, and then obviously some watermarks. So I'm going to show you what this kind of looks like bit by bit. Okay, so this is what it looks like. I'm going to turn on this layer, and it's very subtle, but it does do some stuff. Then the multiply layer, color burn layer, screen layer, textures, and then it looks retro. Now there's one other step that I like to do, which is going into all of my screen tone layers that I put on top of stuff and blurring them. So as you can see, the dots are very visible. So I literally am just on my screen tone layer that's above my background layer. So I'm going to just go to Gaussian blur and just like bump it the slightest bit. Do you see how much it changes? I'm gonna just bump it to like 2 or 1%. And then I'm gonna do the same on all of my screen tone ones. Just go through and bump it to like 1%, maybe 2% max. I don't want like super sharp edges on anything because I want it to look like old, kind of faded. I want it to look like it's been printed a few times. For the distressed layer here, I use Retro Supply Company pens and print distressing brush, I think. So it has a bunch of these different distressing brushes in here. Erosion, heavy abrasion, scuffing. I'll usually use a blend of these in like a white color, and then set it to lighter color and drop the opacity. I will provide a link to brushes and textures in the box below.
And that is basically it for how I do these little comics. So I can show you some close-ups of the finished image, but you can also go over to my webtoon to read it. So let's see the final pages. Alright, that's about it for this video. Let me know if you have any other questions about this, and you can let me know in the comments below. Also tell me which puppet is your favorite, or if you have like a top 3 or something. And also let me know if you would want a physical copy of the puppet's introductions when I get it printed. I would want it to be printed, I think, on paper that feels like a vintage comic. I would want it to feel very like retro inspired and everything. So let me know down below if that's something that you would like to buy in the future. I'm hoping that I'll have it ready by Christmas, but I still have many girls to get through, so it might not be for Christmas. It might be sometime in the new year, but follow me on social media and I will keep you guys updated on that. Alright, now I'm off to do more Dragon Con grind. That's all, folks.